Good afternoon, everyone. Is my mic good? Thank you in the back. I'm going to be careful because I stood right in the projector line. Thank you, Karen. So as Karen mentioned, I'm Matthew. I am the director of the Gender Identity Expression and Sexual Orientation Resource Center. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I'm upstairs on the 4th floor of the Cub in the most beautiful view, probably outside Webster on this campus. If you haven't seen it, well, you probably did during your Alive program, we overlook Kamiak Butte, which was most likely visible during your time here. Sometimes when it's smoky, you can't see anything. So I have you for 45-ish minutes, and I'd like to give you an overview, because I never like to be in a presentation where I might not have a roadmap of where we're going. So first off, I have a few notes and a few definitions, because I think that's important to figure out what we're talking about. A little bit of history. Anyone in History 105 or 305? A few folks. So we're going to talk about why history is important a little bit. Some present-day persecution and what we're seeing happening kind of across the globe. And then what it means to attain refugee status here in the United States or in some of the other countries where we would think folks were going and where the research already exists, so the UK, Australia, et cetera. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to ask. I'm happy to come and listen or answer that. I'll have to repeat it, though, for the cameras since it's being beamed out and they can't hear you, hence why I'm wearing two mics. So, all right, so a disclaimer before we get too far in. This is a heavy topic. We're talking about really sad, awful things that humans are doing to other humans based on their identity, right? I was telling some folks earlier today that I was working and finishing out this presentation yesterday and this morning, and I had to take time away from it because it's just so icky. But I encourage you, if you need to take some time, please do. There's no judgments from me because I get it. I had to walk away, and I do this stuff often. But also, if you can sit through the suffering of others, we oftentimes, even myself included, I'm on the social media and I'm like, oh, I don't want to deal with that right now. I'm just going to look away. And, engage fully if you can, but also take care of yourself. So find a balance for you. So, talk a little bit about language before we get into this, because language is complicated, right? All of us can probably agree that language changes quickly. Slang, in particular, changes very quickly. I joke about words in our office, like yeet. That was not a word when I was, a youthful person, I don't know. And I hate that word, by the way, but I appreciate it for what it is, right? It's come in and out of slang. But words and language in our communities have also changed over time. And so most commonly we see sexual orientation, which is someone's sexual and oftentimes tightly coupled with their romantic orientation or attraction to someone else. And then gender identity and expression is separate, right? So sexual orientation might be gay or lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, whereas gender identity and expression might be trans or gender fluid or gender queer, right? So sexual orientation is who you're attracted to, and gender identity and expression are who you are and how you express yourself. So a very basic level. And there's a little bit of a history because hello. You're probably like, why is it the LGBTQ community? Well, once upon a time, picture the 1850s, not a great time for any of us, probably, in anywhere. There's not a lot of sanitation, et cetera. But a historian summarizes the complexity of language, Susan Stryker, when she writes, in practice, the distinctions between what we now call transgender and gay or lesbian were not always as meaningful back then as they are now. Throughout the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, homosexual desire and gender variance were often closely associated. One common way of thinking about this was gender inversion, or homosexuality as gender inversion, in which a man who was attracted to men was thought to be acting like a woman, and a woman who desired women was considered to be acting like a man. And we see that kind of split out in the early 1900s. But in many ways, these aren't distinguishable concepts in other languages. And so we're talking about the world. A lot of languages are being spoken, a lot of concepts that we would now, sex is the biological components of a person, and gender is the sociological construct. Not every language will have those two, right? Or they may not even delineate at all between sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, et cetera. So we're limited by our language to some extent, but so vibe with me a little as we go through these complicated things. So All right, so I'm going to define forced relocation really quickly. Oftentimes, I think also called forced migration in the literature, depending. So forced relocation refers to the movements of refugees and internally displaced people, those displaced by conflicts, as well as people displaced by natural or environmental disasters, chemical or nuclear disasters, famine or development projects. And the one of the many options of types of forced relocation are conflict-induced displacement, most often for LGBTQ folks, because these are folks who are forced to flee their homes for one or more of the following reasons, and where the state authorities are unable or unwilling to protect them. So armed conflict, including civil war, generalized violence, and persecution on the grounds of nationality, race, religion, political opinion, or, at the very end, social group. And that's usually where LGBTQ folks fall. So an asylum seeker is an individual who is seeking international protection in countries with individualized procedures. An asylum seeker is someone whose claim has not yet been finally decided on by the country in which he or she or they have submitted it. Not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognized as a refugee, but every refugee is initially an asylum seeker, according to Amnesty International. It's a little different, it feels like, in the United States, which I'll talk about in a second. And a refugee is a person who's fled their country of origin and is unable or unwilling to return because of a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of their race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group or political opinion. Now in the US, there's a little bit more complexity, as you probably have seen through any other of your common reading programs or the good old news, which never ends. So in the US, refugees, according to I think it's Immigration Customs Enforcement, I think it's ICE that does this, or maybe Homeland Security, refugee status is a form of protection that may be granted to people who meet the definition of a refugee and who are of a special humanitarian concern to the United States. Refugees are generally people outside of their country who are unable or unwilling to return home because they fear serious harm. You may seek a referral for refugee status only from outside of the United States. In contrast, asylum is a form of protection available to people who meet the definition of a refugee, so they're escaping something, some sort of persecution in their home country. They're already in the United States and or seeking admission at a port of entry. So many times we saw this in the news, right? People were coming in this caravan to the border because they wanted to apply for asylum and to be then considered for refugee status, which is how we do it here. So I think a lot of times the news spun it kind of weird. So I think that's important to note. So I'm going to take a couple comments, and sorry for the folks who are joining us virtually, but why is history important in what we're talking about today when it comes to forced relocation? Have we ever forced relocated people before? Forcefully? Sorry, that was a weird combo. So yes, when was a time that we have forced relocations in our world? You can also talk about our nation, but World War II, absolutely. Japanese internment camps, the Holocaust, which we'll talk about in a moment. But why is history important in that? Because it repeats? So history repeats itself? Yeah, it was so funny that you mentioned that, and that is perfect because I took this class in grad school, looked a couple, and the professor said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And that has stuck with me because it doesn't look the same today as it did once upon a time, but there are a heck of a lot of similarities, right, to seeing what we're seeing today. So, who can tell me what this means? Or what this symbol might, or what the upside down pink triangle might symbolize? Melissa?
It symbolizes the LGBTQ community, and I believe in the Holocaust, folks who were queer had to wear that on their person as well, as opposed to, say, for a swastika or criminal status. So this would be the queer symbol.
So this was the queer symbol during the Holocaust, and it's somewhat been reclaimed, right? Yeah, absolutely. So queer folks had to wear it, mostly men. Queerness is funny, right? And gender roles in society are funny because men are expected to be men, right? And women who are queer sometimes get a little bit more flex in that. Not saying that's right or wrong, just kind of what we're seeing. So, according to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, Between 1933 and 1945, an estimated 100,000 men were arrested for violating Nazi Germany's law against homosexuality. We don't really use that word anymore, but for context, that's what we're using. And of these, approximately 50,000 were sentenced to prison, and an estimated 5,000 to 15,000 men were sent to concentration camps on similar charges, where an unknown number of them perished. There's some estimates between 60 to 75% of queer men in concentration camps died. And you're probably like, why are you bringing this up? But this is a reason that people would have tried to escape, right? We focus so much on Jewish folks trying to escape, which was clearly important, right? But we don't really know anything about if queer folks got out, right? There's just not a lot. I was Googling and on the Google Scholar, which if you haven't used, it's amazing. But there's just not a lot of information because a lot of these records weren't captured, they were destroyed. So I think you probably can gather why Nazis were coming for gay men, but gay men were seen often as asocial by the Nazis, an enemy of the master Aryan race. Led by Heinrich Himmler, the Nazis persecuted gay men in several ways. They shut down a majority of gay bars, they shut down any gay publications, they arrested gay men and tortured them, and forced them to give up their address books and the names of their partners in an attempt to create a registry of all gay men in Germany. And in 1935, they revised a part of their code which banned gay contact. So the law was extended to the concept of criminally indecent activities between men, which meant that the authorities could then arrest any male suspected on limited or no evidence. So they were some of the first folks that were sent to concentration camps in 1933, and they were subject to ridicule and hard work. In the ladder within, or the hierarchy within a concentration camp, gay men were the absolute lowest. They were given the hardest tasks, they were experimented upon, etc. So I have a short video for folks to watch. So I believe all of my videos are captioned or auto-captioned, but if there are any concerns, please let me know. So the Nazis saw gay men as carriers of a disease which weakened the nation. They ransacked the Institute for Sexual Science, closed gay clubs and journals, and created pink lists. They used paragraph 175 of the Criminal Code to punish homosexual behavior. They wanted to morally purify Germany. Between 1933 and 1945, 100,000 men were arrested for violating Nazi Germany's laws against homosexuality. 50,000 of them were sentenced to prison. 5,000 to 15,000 were sent to concentration camps. They were forced to sign confessions and were jailed without trial. In camps, gay prisoners were made to wear pink triangles to single them out. They were a bottom of the concentration camp hierarchy. Beaten or ridiculed by guards, they were often given deadly work assignments. How many perished in the camps is not known. After the war, many had difficulty getting work if employers knew they were arrested under paragraph 175. So Rudolf Brazda was one of the last surviving pink triangle prisoners. So he passed away in 2011 at age 98. So today's cities such as Tel Aviv, Amsterdam, Sydney, and San Francisco have memorials dedicated to the gay victims of the Nazi Holocaust. Were folks familiar with some of this information? Some know. So we often see this picture, credits to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, of book burning, which happened across Nazi Germany. There are some reports that this is of book burning at the Institute for Sexual Science, which I was Googling to confirm whether or not that was true, but I couldn't find any confirmation other than it was a book burning at that same time, or around the same time. But the Institute of Sexual Science was dedicated and devoted to some of the earliest gender affirmation surgeries, which some people may have heard of as sex change operations or something, but now we call gender affirmation surgeries. And all this information that had been done from the early 1900s up through 1930s was burned. One of the leaders of this was put into a concentration camp. The founder, Magnus Hirschfeld, who was known as, at the time, a sexologist, but we would probably call them something very different now, did never return from France. He was like, no, he was called the most dangerous Jew in Germany, and he just fled. So, to a speaking tour in the US before he died. So I bring this back up, though, because as the Allies swept through Europe to victory over the Nazi regime, in early 1945, hundreds of thousands of concentration camp prisoners were liberated. However, the new government of Germany repealed many of the laws, but they left unchanged the paragraph 175. So as gay men were forced to serve out the terms of their imprisonment regardless of time served in the concentration camps. It remained on this paragraph 175 as it was written by Nazi Germany, remained in West Germany until the law was revised in 1969 to decriminalize gay relations between men over the age of 21. However, that really didn't get fully repealed until 1994. So present day persecution. So shout out, and I will repeat it out. How many countries are there in the world right now? Thereabouts. How many? How many? 219? Okay. How many? It's always changing, so close enough for jazz is fine. Anyone else willing to take a guess? This is a very unbold crowd. 195, thereabouts, right? There are 195 countries. And so how many countries do you think outlaw gay relationships right now in some capacity? More than half. Thanks. I had to do a quick math in my head. What else? 125. Oh, way more than half on that one. What else? It is lower, which is exciting, I think. 77. And about how many countries have a death penalty for gay people? 20? Anyone else willing to take a guess? Should have brought candy, I'm so sorry. Probably would have made people more bold. 5, or thereabouts. So again, things have changed. I got these statistics from Rainbow Refugee. And again, to note that gender, sex, and sexual orientation are diffuse concepts in English, not always the same in others. But some of the laws, in particular on trans folks, they exist to say, no cross-dressing, or, males can't wear females' clothes. Very binary, very much based on that sex concepts in English, but very much not the diffusion that there is here. And cross-dressing is against the law in at least 9 countries. And I think we also have to note that laws don't equate perfection or acceptance or equity, right? I was just talking today to someone about marriage equality in the United States, and while it's great, and we're seeing that marriage equality is having a positive impact on queer youth not wanting to hurt themselves, we still haven't solved a lot of other problems around being targeted by certain groups, not having housing protections in all states or employment protections, on and on. So the next video I'm going to show before I get to it, has anyone heard of Chechnya? Okay, I got a handful of people. You don't have to tell me what it is, so if you've heard of it, that's okay. And I won't call on you to be like, tell me all about the history of Chechnya, because I had to really look into it. So Chechnya is it's a republic within Russia, in Russia. And in March of 2017, they began a crackdown within some of, I think their capital city, on men they were suspected to be gay or having, same-sex relationships. And so Kardarov, who's the leader of Chechnya, I forget his official title because his dad's also, didn't spend a lot of time looking at Chechnya relations with the world, but he has a very colorful view of the world. And so I will say that it's not the most uplifting video I've seen, but this is Kardarov, the leader of Chechnya. Oh, I'm sorry. Part of it is not subtitled.
вони шайтани, вони поддажні, вони нелюди. Будьте они прокляты за то, что они на нас наговаривают. Они перед Всевышним все равно ответят за это. Америка ведет политику против России.
So he just kind of goes on to how he feels America is treating Russia and Chechnya. But there are tons of reports of men being snatched up off the streets from wherever and then taken to what we would consider probably some sort of concentration camp-like facility where they're held, beaten, tortured, and then released depending within like a few weeks. And the next video is a survivor of one of those who did ultimately gained freedom and then status within Canada, which is kind of perfect based on what he was talking about. So
they wanted to destroy me, like I'm nothing.
Ahmed Durailov survived torture. The 27-year-old is from Chechnya and survived an anti-gay purge in the Russian Republic.
Was, all about getting better, and they were using sheets, plastic pipes, along pipes. And after they started using electroshock.
Durailov says soldiers kidnapped him from a hair salon he was working at in 2017 before bringing him to a secret torture facility where other gay men were being held. For 2 weeks, he thought about how he would escape and contemplated suicide.
I was thinking to stop this. And each time I was, screaming, standing up because I couldn't see even my hands, handcuffs.
Human Rights Watch says gay purges in Chechnya have continued. Gay men are captured, beaten, and outed to their families. Durailov says after 2 weeks in the secret jail, soldiers took him and other men to a hall where their families were waiting.
They were asking to kill us. Yeah, clearly. And take us shit, stuff like that,
Like they asked your parents.
Exactly.
Durailov was able to go home, but he knew he was no longer welcome there. He got in touch with Bisexual Asylum, a longtime friend living in Moscow. But Asylum soon found himself in danger after being outed. The two were saved by Rainbow Railroad, a charity that helps LGBT people escape violence.
I can't believe it. It's real. Everything is real.
The two friends became lovers and now live together in Toronto. They are starting to share their story at events like this Rainbow Railroad fundraiser in Winnipeg. And together, they are enjoying freedom and the rights that come with living in Canada.
We're just two young men who live in our best lives. And I don't get tired telling this, and I won't because I really believe this. Can you see that?
And they hope wherever they go next, their story will inspire others. Oscar Crowther, CBC News, Winnipeg.
So a happy ending to a rather sad story, but there are numerous others, right, being captured and taken into these places. And I haven't seen a lot lately of new men being taken, but it comes up every year or 6 months or so, where it really hits the press again. But again, a lot of folks in Chechnya don't want to talk about it because there's this shame. It's very interesting, even here in the U.S., we always look for different resources in different languages to help. A lot of folks don't have parents who speak English as their first language, and so we always look for those materials. And there's just not a lot, even in Russian, to help explain some of these concepts and how to support. So, attaining refugee status or getting asylum is complicated, if you probably could gather. And as I've learned more and more, it's just sadder and sadder. And I'm going to share some narratives today that, again, are not so uplifting, but I think they're important to understand. So there's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. And it was created in 1951, and there was some guidance in maybe 67, and there have been some guidance since. But their purpose and their overview and function really is a UN refugee agency, which is a global organization dedicated to saving lives, protecting rights, and building a better future for refugees, forcibly displaced communities, and stateless people from their website. And then their function is they work to ensure that everybody has the right to seek asylum and find safe refuge, having fled violence, persecution, war, or disaster at home. So that's kind of their function. They are doing a lot with probably not enough resources, but they've issued at least 2 statements that I could find on guidance to help support LGBTQ asylum seekers and refugees. So once in 2008 and once in 2012. And I have to say, I'm going to give you some of the pieces from it, so I apologize for reading some of the text, but it's really thoughtful. I don't know, maybe my expectations are kind of low sometimes because I'm just like so worried about people and like how are we inflicting unintentional harm? But these are so thoughtful. So, so the process, right? You have to create a narrative and explain your case, right, of why you deserve asylum and refugee status, and then you have to provide some proof, right? They're not just letting everyone in, which I have some feelings about that personally, but there's a lot of gatekeeping, right, to keep folks out. And then there's credibility. So according to Rachel Lewis, who wrote some really great pieces on all of this, on queer asylum seekers, she writes, unlike other refugee claimants who are not compelled to perform a visible identity in the country to which they migrate, lesbian and gay asylum applicants are thus expected to conform to Western stereotypes of male homosexual behavior based on visibility, consumption, and an identity in the public sphere in order to be considered worthy candidates for asylum. So people are expected to behave in a particular way based on our notions in places they're looking for, right? Maybe the US or Australia or the UK. What does it mean in your mind, right? If you think about media perceptions and portrayals of many gay men or lesbians, that might be what, since there might be bias in the folks who are reading these applications, interviewing these people, then they're expected to be like that, right? And I'm not gonna go into all the stereotypes of queer people because you can open up anything. Except for Netflix, sometimes super great. Like I see you, Netflix, trying to do your best. But see, like Will and Grace might be a good example for that. And so, according to the UNHCR's guidelines, ascertaining the applicant's LGBTI, they use I instead of Q, which means intersex, background is essentially an issue of credibility. The assessment of credibility in such cases needs to be undertaken in an individualized and sensitive way, which I loved. Exploring elements around the applicant's personal perceptions, feelings, and experiences of difference, stigma and shame are usually more likely to help the decision maker ascertain the applicant's sexual orientation or gender identity rather than a focus on sexual practices. So they are supposed to ask, open-ended questions, specific questions, really, interview someone with a bunch of kind of like how-tos and how-not-tos. So self-identification, which this is so great, right? Self-identification as an LGBTI person should be taken as an indication of the applicant's sexual orientation and or gender identity. So if I say that I'm gay, you should believe me, right? Or at least that should outweigh so much, right? Instead of me, because it might be really hard for me just to say that in the first place. But even if I don't, there's other ways to, kind of tease that out. Especially if I'm with family, just depending on what part of the world I'm from, religious background, etc. So applicants from highly intolerant countries may, for instance, not readily identify as LGBTI. This alone should not rule out the applicant. This should not rule out that the applicant could have a claim based on sexual orientation or gender identity where other indicators are present. So there's some concerns around gender identity and how can people dress, what should they look like, right? If we live in a Western world and we expect people to look, like a man or a woman, and if folks are wearing different clothes and we don't understand those, nuances or those cultures, then we could be making the wrong decision too. So some invisibility, which I found to be not at all surprising, but really interesting. So 2 areas of real invisibility have been lesbians and bisexuals. So first, they're often invisible in the asylum process. As all asylum seekers, they're asked to prove their sexual orientation. As one lesbian asylum seeker in one of the Lewis articles states, the officials wanted me to prove that I was a lesbian, but they wouldn't tell me how I could. Like, how do you do that, right? Like, how am I, and some of the others, which I don't have the exact statement, but, and this is super bizarre to me, but there are people who are seeking asylum. So the one case study that I saw in one of the articles was a woman, or excuse me, a man from the UK, he had found this guy from Malawi. The guy was looking for refuge in the UK. And the way that they proved that they were having, that the man from Malawi was gay was by sending in extremely intimate photos of themselves. That was their proof, and it worked. And so lawyers don't always encourage that, but it seems like that was a huge encouragement, is to send in photos with another man. So from GLAAD, Gays and Lesbians Against Defamation. So a blogger wrote, when I started my asylum process, there was no question in my mind that I would apply as bisexual. As we do these days, I Google searched bisexual asylum. Back then, the results page showed failed bisexual asylum claims and even had a link to an immigration organization that implied that seeking asylum as a bisexual was a bad idea. Everything online told me not to apply as bisexual, but to apply for asylum as a gay person. I've been mislabeled a lesbian in the past by overexcited journalists and people who thought they knew more about me than I did myself, but this was different. I couldn't bring myself to even consider lying about who I am after I had left my home because it was unsafe for me to be who I was. So her lawyer even asked her if she would consider seeking asylum as a lesbian because it would, quote, improve my chances, unquote. Like it was a choice I could make. The false assumption that adjudicators and judges make right now is that a bisexual person, you can go choose to be in a relationship with someone of the opposite gender and pass as straight and hence be safe in your home country. And that was all over the literature. So just pretend, like how can you be really persecuted if you can choose who you're attracted to? But she was the first bisexual asylum, like successful bisexual asylum seeker in the country she applied for asylum. I think it was the United States. So lots of invisibility and also really terrible odds of being approved. Much harder to get approved for sexual orientation or gender identity than some of the others, violence, and maybe some of the other protected or other classes of social identities that we've talked about. So that was a short video, another one, I know. So we are LGBTQ refugees. So
My name is Alon.
My name is Ishala. My name is Eda. I am LGBT.
I felt myself because I now say this personality mentioned of being living just in the closet. You can't hold hands. You can't live your life out. It's very dangerous, not only personal, but
I came to the United States, fleeing my country, because I was rejected dead by a political party. I want to know more because advocacy, working with me, access to healthcare services. Because of my work, it puts me at danger of the persecution that we live in discrimination, things like that. I'm running for my country because my life is in danger and the immigration officer told me that I was going to be in jail.
It was very painful to be in prison when I was asking, yelling out for help. No one responded to me except the immigration authorities. I found this amazing organization who stayed by me and go with me in this journey.
when I got asylum, it was amazing. I felt protected. I felt like maybe in the future I would have a place to call home.
I've been fighting to be free as a gay man, and I felt like there was a point in my life where the tides turned around.
Refugees are one of the strongest people. Not only they survived the country that they came from, but they had the courage to learn the process, to speak up, to pursue.
My case is a good example that we came to this country to contribute, that we came to this country to help others too.
I'm a small business owner. I'm a metalsmith and a jewelry designer. I have an office in Japan.
I'm the director of Heritage and Refugees Shelter in New York City.
My work is to provide services for people living with HIV.
As of 2017, I'm a citizen of the United States. Coming here is allowed me to realize my full potential and maximum is saving for success.
I'm excited about what will happen in the future and I'm waiting for the day where I'll become a US citizen.
If you are an LGBTQ person, a person living, and you fear persecution in your country as a refugee, you may be eligible for asylum. If you need help, you can contact us at immigrationequality.org.
If you'd like to help us, go to immigrationequality.org/donate.
So there are a few nonprofits that are working on these things, and there are some success stories, and I try to end on a happier, more uplifting note that there is hope for change. But there's no, like if you come to the United States, there's no legal support necessarily for you to get your asylum or to apply for refugee status, all that. It's all either nonprofits or you have the funds like when you come, but that's so rare, right? I mean, I can't afford a lawyer for like extensive processes, right? Oops, sorry. So with that being said, if you or someone you know is in need of immigration help or support here or at any of our other campuses, including Global, you can check out our immigration clinic. So you can check my name out, matthew.jeffries@wcu.edu, and I'll get you connected to that. They're happy to do like a Zoom or a Skype session with someone that's not here in Pullman. They're an incredible resource that we have through the University of Idaho, a partnership between WSU and the University of Idaho. Undocumented initiatives, Marcella Pattinson is an incredible resource. Together, she and I, and now UW Seattle, we've worked really closely together over the past years, it feels like, to co-host an undocuqueer conference. So our focus is on looking at those intersections between immigration and being queer, which are complicated, right? When we often talk about one, we haven't talked about the other. And I think this illuminates some of those reasons why we need to have those conversations. And last but certainly not least, there's my office, the longest department probably ever, GIESORC, Cub 401. So, do you all have questions, comments? We all have concerns, I would gather, by this point. Questions? I'm gonna say your question, I'm gonna repeat it out.
Okay, so you said there are 5 countries that
Yeah.
do you by chance remember what the other
They don't legally have it, I don't think, on their books, but Brunei is one that just did it. So I'm gonna cough. So I can't remember the other 4, but Brunei is one. And so you may remember, well, depending on what kind of news media you follow, the Sultan of Brunei is like, they added to the constitution that they can stone like men who are caught having sex with other men to death. And then he's like, we're not gonna enforce it. Then why would you put it in your constitution? So there was a real big backlash from folks because the Sultan of Brunei, or the Brunei government maybe, owned some properties in the United States. And so people were like, boycott those properties. So, and if you're not, that's a great point though. If you're not following anyone who's on like Twitter, folks on Twitter? Okay, cool. And I don't know, I'm sure they do Snapchat and TikTok, all that stuff too. But follow some queer news media outlets. You will be amazed at what you're missing. Right? I do this for like communities that I'm a part of, like the queer community. I do this for communities that I'm not a part of, so I can see what's happening in those spaces because mainstream media is so focused on like mainstreamy things, right? And not looking at all these smaller subsets of our populations, which are so important. So, but thank you for your question. I'm sorry I don't have all the list. What else we got? Summer. Okay. Did you want to get back to you?
Did you encounter any deportation issues in the United States? Partly this is coming from the talk last week. Peter Wilson said that someone from ICE said that they don't regard immigrants and refugees as indifferent. You have papers in your hand.
Gotcha. So, I did not see anything about that. Yeah, oh, sorry. The question was, did you see any deportations based on like LGBT status or identity?
People who perhaps tried to come for seeking asylum, but if you were a documented being.
Gotcha. Yeah, so did I see any of LGBT folks who came for asylum and then get deported? I didn't see any of that, but I don't think they're also curating those numbers well, or the data doesn't exist as well as maybe some of the other social identities. But I was gonna say, a lot of countries wouldn't take LGBTQ folks in until more recently. And there have been a lot of histories around folks with HIV coming into the United States. That was banned for a long time. And so I don't know where that falls now because things are bopping around quite a bit, flip-flopping. I mean, even trans in the military has been a huge topic that keeps flip-flopping. And so I didn't check on that. But I think if you saw immigration equality, they talked about if you're an LGBTQ person or if you are living with HIV, that there might be complications, and so how you can apply for refugee status. So, thank you. Yeah, sorry.
I guess even within marginalized groups like the LGBT community, there are still like different hierarchies of oppression, and that like I guess certain identities are prioritized over others. And you find, I mean, obviously this is interconnected with like racism or even like sexism, and I guess do you find this, or do you think this is an issue that will resolve over time, or are there steps you think that we as a community and we need to like,
Yeah. So the comment and question was, there are already internalized issues within the queer communities, right? And do you think those will resolve, right? There's issues around racism and classism and ability, amongst a bunch of others. So do you think they'll be solved? I really hope so, because otherwise my job would be very sad. But I think it requires all of us to work together. I think once we realize that a lot of our oppressions are rooted together, right? And we've been divided over time because that allowed people to stay in power, that will be the day that we see like true change, right? Like when we all group together of folks who've been marginalized and oppressed for whatever of our social identities that have been picked upon, right? When we work together, then things will change. And that's what I think is so important about like undocuqueer, right? It is exposing, like we took a bunch of students that were more connected to my center in GIESORC and students that were more connected to undocumented student services to see like the complexities of both sides and to see those identities together, because sometimes we get lost in our own worlds that we don't think about these complex lived experiences that people are having, right? Like for instance, undocumented folks, they don't have access to sometimes Planned Parenthood. I don't know all the rules of Planned Parenthood, but if you're not a citizen or you don't have certain like documentation, you can't go. So then where do you go as a person, right? If you're queer and undocumented and maybe you have HIV, which I think was the blog that I had read, like where do you turn to next, right? If you're a student, you have queer health services, but once you're not a student, if you don't have health insurance or you don't have the money, right? What are your opportunities? And together, like that means that healthcare is a queer issue and it's an undocumented issue, right? Just like affordable housing is an issue for all of us, right? Folks who are queer are often, especially youth, are homeless or houseless. And so housing is an issue for all of us to address, and healthcare is an issue for all of us to address, because it all serves us differently. Sorry, I can go on about that for ages. So. Go back to you.